Welcome to another edition of Application Security in Action. My name is Chris Miller, and today we'll explore yet another aspect of building a highly effective application security program. Buckle up. Having worked with dozens of Fortune 50 and international organizations to build or rebuild their application security program, I've observed many instances of program failure due to the misalignment of policy and compliance in their program. Today's video will provide best practices to overcome challenges in this area. Our learning objectives for today include why alignment of policy and compliance is essential to achieve success in your AppSec program, the goals and outcomes we're seeking from this habit of best practice, and finally, best practice characteristics for aligning these critical elements to your program. While our focus is to address application security programs, many of the factors represented are applicable to any discipline or program where external regulatory or internally prescribed compliance is required. Please note that some of these topics are just too broad to include in an introductory video such as this. Consequently, I'll create additional videos in the future to provide a deep dive for these extended topics. So why are achieving alignment between your organizational policies and your actual compliance to these policies so crucial? Well, at the heart of it, different stakeholders hold different views of execution against these goals. Your C-suite may assume success that hasn't yet been achieved, which in turn may cause funding to be cut, as there's an assumption that the race is won. This insufficient funding leads to insufficient code quality, and inevitably a data breach occurs, costing you fines, customers, and a loss of reputation. In the meantime, you are generating frustration between your stakeholders, leading to a breakdown in collaboration and achievement. The best practices I'm about to present all drive to achieve very specific goals, resulting in critical outcomes required for the success of your program. These outcomes include ensuring common understanding of status of risk in your organization, ensuring a common understanding of compliance targets amongst your stakeholders, the alignment of practices to the organizational goals, and finally, aligning your actual achievement to your organizational goals. Let's take a quick tour of best practices characteristics of aligned policy and compliance in your AppSec program. First, you have to establish and practice formal policies and governance. Your policies must be aligned to the risk tolerance of your organization. You must have vertical alignment of your supporting standards, guidelines, and procedures to those formal policies. Your operational practice must be aligned to the formal procedures that support your formal policy. Your organization's application inventory must include appropriate risk profiles aligning to the policy. And finally, periodic reviews of formal policies, standards, guidelines, configuration, and architectural patterns must be executed. Let's explore each of these in a little bit more detail. But before we do, let's recognize some basic truths about human nature. Human beings tend to expend effort to avoid pain and maximize return on perceived benefits for the investment made with the effort. They won't simply donate their effort to actions which conflict with other priorities or that don't align to these gratifications. Even charitable giving and philanthropic activity have some payoff in recognition from respected others in your life, increased social standing, or simply feeling good about oneself. Developers have many priorities, and we need to provide them with a case to drive behaviors to make secure coding a priority over simply producing more code. See Habit 2 videos for more techniques to successfully engage your developers. But for the moment, let's talk about providing a foundation for your secure coding practice. This starts with setting expectations. The foundation of setting and meeting expectations will be codified in formal policies and supporting documents. This will include formal application security policies, standards, architectural patterns, guidelines, and procedures. Habit 1 videos go into greater detail, but think of policies as rules, the internal laws to follow. Standards and architectural patterns define how to technically achieve these rules. Guidelines are literally recommendations without the rule of law. Now, I'm not real big on guidelines, as they typically aren't followed. There is one legitimate use case where guidelines have value. You could use them as pre-standards to allow for an adoption period before compliance is compromised by not following them. Next, you have procedures representing a portion of your affected runbooks, providing steps to operationalize all of these elements into your environment. Together, these documents form an interdependent set of guidance, forming the foundation of your program governance. Now, you'll also need an application security program charter. Now, this will codify the purpose, goals, governance, and RACI for the program itself. All these documents do you no good unless you communicate them to the appropriate stakeholders within your program and employ strong sponsorship techniques to speed adoption. Whether you're persuading reinforcing sponsors to act or contending with bedroll lawyers in your organization, formally documenting these rules and expectations with executive approval and sponsorship of the results will provide you with the formal governance to drive behaviors. Speaking of sponsorship, to succeed, your ACPSEP program must have active sponsorship, expressing, modeling, and reinforcing expectations and behaviors as defined within these foundational documents. See Habit 1 and general topic videos for more information about sponsorship, building program charters, policy standards and guidelines, and other related topics. Now, flat out, most organizations miss the boat in having the walk aligned to the talk when it comes to matching formal policy with the true risk tolerance of the organization. Generally, it comes in the form of talking tough, but then not having much appetite to enforce. There's lip service for zero tolerance, but under pressure, leaders at all levels tend to choose expediency over security. Aside from actuaries and some accounts, almost none of the stakeholders you'll be dealing with have a clear understanding of the principles, much less the practice of risk management. Without quantification of risk, with a common understanding of such amongst all stakeholders, realistic definition of risk tolerance is almost impossible to achieve, because no one is even talking the same language. Another challenge is translating the technical risk into business terms. How much loss will occur, and at what probability? Here we are hamstrung because, unlike most insurance categories, we don't have good estimates for either. This is because the experience of our isolated organization does not have sufficient loss events to provide statistical integrity for these calculations. Another challenge is that we have terrible visibility into the experience of the world outside of our organization. While this exercise to achieve alignment may be dull, it is critical to have everyone communicating on the same definitions of acceptable risk. Risk management is a discipline in itself and can take many years to master. However, I will post a future video on the basics in Habit 1. In the meantime, glean what you can from the internet sources. The bottom line, don't make up rules that you can't or won't keep. This is actually worse than not doing anything to formalize your requirements, as you not only destroy your current credibility, but points in future activities as well. Who will believe any of this is real when they get away with ignoring it the first time? Unfortunately, defining and aligning risk tolerance is only one problem area. Achieving and maintaining alignment up and down policies, standards, patterns, guidelines, and procedures is also very difficult. The challenge is mostly in the mechanics. First, multiple stakeholders have different knowledge and experience. The very real factor of everyone simply having a different frame of reference and sometimes differing understandings of specific terminology and acronyms. Simple differences in reading comprehensive can be problematic. Beyond the raw ability to distill understanding from the written word, there are also environmental and linguistic nuances that affect understanding. Consequently, review by multiple players won't necessarily have the same understanding of the meaning and impacts of the written clauses. Second, multiple stakeholders have different priorities and drivers, leading to a natural conflict in the outcomes. You absolutely want different stakeholders' views and opinions within the creation process, but this doesn't mean you'll get consensus or even partial agreement. Next, traceability mapping takes discipline. For example, every clause in a standard or pattern must be traceable back to the clause of authority within the policy. You will often see one-to-many relationships, and this makes the traceability even harder to do. Often, stakeholders creating or revising these artifacts will have ineffective review techniques. Can you really sit around a table with a dozen people through multiple versions of change? Do players even read ahead for efficiency? Or setting up a round robin of edits via collaboration tools with even a chance of mutually understood versions? Being successful requires both an investment in time from all the players involved, as well as a discipline in contributing their part of the process. Another factor is just volume. There are a lot of documents to maintain and lots of text to go through, which leads to the last factor. This is just boring activity. Even with the best intent, most people and teams simply run out of gas, and quality of output diminishes throughout the exercise. Often the last documents get no more than a cursory look. By now, you may have detected some past trauma from my work history concerning these topics. I will post a deep dive video under Habit 1 with more tangents and exploration concerning good creation and maintenance of AppSec related policies, standards, guidelines, and other governing documents. While not my favorite topic, it is incredibly important to address this vertical alignment with vigor and accuracy. Without agreement between your governing documents, you might as well not have bothered at all. So what can you do? You must put disciplined best practices into your process. First of all, ensure roles and responsibilities for the review and output are documented, communicated, and mutually understood. Clearly define who is making decisions. Avoid rule via consensus. I mean, let's face it, you put 3 people together, it's almost impossible to get agreement, much less a larger group. Avoid being overly inclusive. Determine the necessary frames of reference and pick one player for each. Ensure processes are clearly documented, communicated, and mutually understood. Don't assume people know how to effectively map between document levels. Provide training and examples. Provide coaching as needed. Communicate and stick with the workflow and timetables. Don't make people relearn the steps each time. Let them know that deadlines are meaningful. Provide glossaries for terms and acronyms, closing the gap in understanding. Hold players accountable for tasks and timely completion. If they are ineffective, disruptive, or don't complete tasks on time, drop them and seek another resource. So, you've got your expectations codified. Your risk tolerance matches your defined PSG, and the documents at each level perfectly support each other. What could go wrong? Well, are you actually executing to these anchors? Do the behaviors and practices align to your formal governance documentation? In my experience working with hundreds of programs, this is more often not the case. There are many reasons for this. By no means an exhaustive list, and in no particular order, these factors include undefined or misunderstood authority levels. Who really has the decision? So document clearly which role is making the decision and any consequences of wrong decisions. As with the last topic, never allow consensus decision making as it removes accountability. The second element is competing priorities, where the relationships between the business driver and the security drivers are not clearly defined in a hierarchy. Here's a pro hint for you. Security is a business driver. Start talking about the security quality of code in business terms. The third element is stakeholders not understanding the true nature of risk. This is why it's key to define acceptability in advance and in a manner that someone doesn't need to be a risk management expert to understand. The last element for today is having an undefined process, which leaves ambiguity where the authority lays. Too often it comes down to the stronger personality making the decision, and there's a substantial probability that this may not be the right stakeholder. Clearly defining the authority levels to individuals that do understand risk can have a concrete positive impact in avoiding bad decisions. For the moment, let's take for granted that you have an accurate application inventory. Are all assets in that inventory of equal value? Likely not, though they all have some value. Some factors to consider: ascertain the value of the app to your operation. What does it cost for each minute or hour that it's unavailable? Determine the value of the data to your organization. What functions of your business depend on this data, and what are the downstream impacts when you lose the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the data for a period of time or forever? What impacts do you have from regulatory prosecution or simply the loss of your customers' confidence? What is the exposure of the application? Is it external or internal facing? Is it a web app or a mobile app? Or is it a mainframe buried deep within your network? What mitigating controls are in place to reduce the risk of compromise? And can you afford to protect all the assets at the same level? Most organizations can't, so you need to spend your money on controls appropriate to the value of the data. As stated earlier in the video, risk management is an entire practice which I cannot relate in a short form video like this one. However, there are numerous sources on the web, and I will be returning to some basics in future videos. For now, let's presume that you have this information. What do you do with it? Well, you need to build risk profiles. I myself have experienced and certainly observed on many occasions poorly constructed and applied risk profiles. I want to share some best practices with you to save you the trouble of doing it twice. First of all, create a clear hierarchy with as simple a construct as you can get away with. Avoid the use of more than two data dimensions, such as exposure environment mapped against the data value or business value, or perhaps exposure environment mapped against the data sensitivity label. If your organization has mature business continuity or disaster recovery practices, you may have values that are already pre-calculated that you can leverage. Ensure that you end up with a single end value that is based on your currency of choice. Avoid the overuse of tags such as particular data protection regulations, as this may introduce a third, fourth, or even higher level of multiple dimensions into your hierarchy. Simply factor this data element into your matrix. Don't overcomplicate your profile system. Try to have 6 or fewer total profiles and make your naming convention as clean as possible so that even a layperson would understand the hierarchy of risk based on the names alone. Now, presuming that these risk profiles will be used for perhaps network security or other needs, where you define them may vary. A good candidate governance document might be the data classification policy or standard. However, your application security program charter must include your requirements for acceptable risk and testing requirements. Literally, how many of the severity or type of flaw vulnerabilities are acceptable, and what type of security testing is required at what cadence. This will avoid the traps of having different rules by application or business unit, keeping the requirements simple for the process practitioners. In the last topic for this video, we'll talk about keeping your governance documents accurate and relevant. Best practices include, at a minimum, an annual review of all related policies, standards, patterns, and guidelines. And don't forget about your AppSec program charter. All related procedures, supporting documents, tool configuration, and templates will need to be done as well. Adjust and modify for drift and changes in the risk environment. In today's video, we've talked about effective best practices to align your policy and compliance practices in your AppSec program. These include establish and practice formal policies and governance, policies aligned to the true risk tolerance of your organization, vertical alignment of standards, guidelines, and procedures to your formal policies, operational alignment of practices and procedures to the formal policy, organization of application inventory and appropriate risk profiles aligning to policy, and finally, holding periodic reviews of formal policy, standards, guidelines, configurations, architectural patterns, and indeed, your AppSec charter. Because we're technical people, we often want to jump in and start doing. Unfortunately, without setting up your program for success by aligning to policies and program charter, you will hit a wall. Make incorporation of all of these best practices a priority, and your AppSec program will begin to produce more success and lower risk to your organization at a surprising rate. I hope you found today's material useful. Please like and subscribe to the channel to ensure that you don't miss out on any new content diving into greater detail on these and other topics. Have a great day and keep the bad guys away.